Let me ask you something, straight from the heart. If the person who once broke you stood in front of you today, would you fight for your dignity or walk away in silence? This story, it's not just drama, it's about every moment life dared to test our worth. And I know you've had one too. Trust me, you'll feel every word. So stay with me, because what happens next might just change how you see yourself forever. The night air over Monaco was heavy with the scent of salt water and expensive perfume. Under a string of golden lights stretched along the harbor, the world's most powerful people gathered for the launch of the Eternité, a super yacht so lavish it made other luxury vessels look like fishing boats. Champagne flutes clinked, cameras flashed, and whispers floated between silk-clad guests like ripples in the sea. At the center of it all stood Adrian Kane. Tall, broad-shouldered, immaculately tailored, wearing a smirk that said he owned more than just the yacht moored behind him. And on his arm, in a glittering backless gown, was a young woman who seemed determined to claim every eye in the crowd. Her name was Serena Vale, Adrian's new companion, though most of Monaco already knew her as the woman who replaced his wife. It wasn't just gossip. Just 6 months earlier, Adrian had been photographed with Serena at a gala in Dubai, his hand resting intimately on her waist. The scandal had been splashed across European tabloids for weeks. But what made it sting sharper for those who knew the backstory was that Adrian's wife, Isabella Moore, had been nowhere in sight that night. She hadn't been in sight since the divorce either. Not in society columns, not at charity balls, not even in casual Instagram snaps from friends. The former Mrs. Kane had simply vanished, leaving behind a storm of speculation. Some said she was hiding from shame. Others whispered she'd gone abroad to lick her wounds. And Adrian? He'd taken full advantage of her silence. Tonight was the perfect example. The Eternité's launch wasn't just a celebration of maritime engineering, it was Adrian's victory lap. The guest list read like a who's who of global finance, politics, and old money dynasties. Contracts worth hundreds of millions were waiting to be signed over glasses of Dom Pérignon. Every handshake tonight was a power play, and Adrian had staged it so that Serena was by his side for each one. "Adrian, my friend," boomed Count Jules Devereux, striding forward with a wineglass in hand. "You've outdone yourself." Adrian's eyes gleamed. "It's only the beginning," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard by the journalists hovering nearby. And then, as if on cue, Serena let out a laugh so delicate and rehearsed it could have been bottled. She leaned into him, whispering something that made him grin wider. Cameras caught the moment instantly. From the deck of the Eternité, the scene looked perfect. A billionaire host, his beautiful dating backdrop of the Monaco harbor. But beneath the polished surface was the raw, unresolved truth. Adrian Kane had once made those same smiles for someone else. And that someone, if you believe the whispers, was still somewhere in Europe. At the far end of the dock, unnoticed at first, a different kind of luxury slid into view. Its hull was deep navy, almost black, reflecting the city's lights like liquid gold. Sleek, understated, and without a name painted on the side, it was the kind of yacht that didn't need introductions. Its owner's reputation was enough. Those who noticed it murmured quietly, "That's Victor Sterling's yacht." A man in a white linen suit whispered to his companion, "He never comes to these things." Victor Sterling, billionaire investor, reclusive philanthropist. A man who could crash markets with a single phone call, yet somehow remained a mystery even to the world's gossip-hungry press. People said he valued privacy more than profit, that he only appeared at events when it truly mattered, which made his sudden arrival intriguing. The crew lowered the gangway, and a tall figure stepped onto the dock. For a moment the crowd squinted against the yacht's deck lights. Then came the murmurs, sharper now, tinged with disbelief. A woman, graceful, confident, hair swept back in a loose, elegant chignon. Her gown, ivory silk with a daring slit, moved like water with each step. But it wasn't just the dress or the diamonds at her ears that caught the room's attention. It was her face. Isabella Moore. For the first time in half a year, she was here, and not alone. Victor Sterling walked at her side, offering his arm as if she were royalty. The effect on the crowd was electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Investors who had been clinking glasses with Adrian moments earlier now craned their necks toward the woman in white. The flashes from photographers doubled, the clicking of shutters almost drowning out the music from the string quartet. On the Eternité, Serena's painted smile faltered for the first time that night. "Adrian," she murmured, "isn't that?" Adrian's smirk froze in place. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. He simply stared as Isabella and Victor crossed the dock, every inch of their body language broadcasting quiet power. She didn't glance at Adrian. Not once. Her eyes scanned the crowd as though she were the host of this glittering evening. Her chin lifted just enough to say, "I belong here." By the time she and Victor reached the center of the harbor, the air was thick with whispers. Someone claimed they'd heard Isabella was now running her own design firm. Another swore she'd been in negotiations with European royalty on a private commission. None of them knew the truth, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Adrian forced a laugh, turning to the nearest group of guests. "Well," he said, his tone light but strained, "seems Monaco has decided to give us all a surprise tonight." But deep down, he knew. This wasn't Monaco's surprise. This was hers. Across the dock, Isabella exchanged a few quiet words with Victor. He leaned closer, his hand resting briefly at the small of her back. Whatever he said made her lips curve into a smile, the kind that wasn't for cameras. And though Adrian couldn't hear it, he felt the message like a punch to the gut. Isabella Moore was no longer the woman he'd left behind. She was someone far more dangerous. Because tonight wasn't just about the launch of a yacht. It was the beginning of a storm Adrian Kane would never see coming. Long before she stepped off Victor Sterling's yacht and silenced an entire harbor, Isabella Moore had lived a very different kind of life. Born in a modest neighborhood of Savannah, Georgia, Isabella was the only child of Thomas and Elaine Moore, owners of a small but well-loved furniture restoration shop. The shop was the kind of place where time slowed down, where old mahogany dressers were brought back to life and stories were told over cups of sweet tea while paint dried in the back room. Her parents had taught her two things: craftsmanship and integrity. If you put your name on something, her father used to say, make sure it's worth keeping. It was a lesson she carried into adulthood, into her career as an interior designer, where she blended Southern warmth with European elegance in a way that caught the attention of high-end clients. It was during one such project in Atlanta that she met Adrian Kane. He wasn't the billionaire he would later become. Back then, he was a hungry entrepreneur with a string of real estate flips under his belt and an almost magnetic self-confidence. He had hired Isabella to design the interiors of a boutique hotel he was developing, and from the very first meeting there had been a spark, or perhaps, as she would later realize, a calculated charm. Adrian pursued her with an intensity that was flattering and overwhelming all at once. Lavish dinners, weekend getaways, promises of a shared future where her talent would be celebrated and her heart protected. Within a year, they were married in an intimate ceremony overlooking the Amalfi Coast, the kind of wedding that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. At first, life with Adrian was as golden as the light in those photographs. She traveled with him to property openings in Paris, Dubai, and Singapore. He'd introduce her as my brilliant wife to investors and business partners. They bought a penthouse in New York and a summer villa in Saint-Tropez. For a while, it felt like they were building something together. A life, an empire, a legacy. But slowly, the cracks began to show. Adrian's compliments became less about her skill and more about how she looked on his arm. He started making decisions without her. First in business, then in their personal life. She'd come home from a design consultation to find that he had canceled their dinner plans because he needed to attend an investor's poker game. He told her it was all for the business, that she should understand. And she did. At least she tried to. The turning point came in their 5th year of marriage. Isabella had been working quietly on a project close to her heart. A scholarship fund for young designers from small towns, just like she had once been. She had spent months lining up donors, securing partnerships, and preparing a presentation for a major charity gala in Monaco. But when the night arrived, Adrian took her aside, his tone clipped and dismissive. "I think you should skip this one," he said. "It's not really your crowd. I'll handle it." Her crowd. As though she hadn't been part of his world for years. as though the people in that glittering ballroom were somehow above her. She had stayed home that night, sitting on their balcony with a glass of wine, staring at the city lights. That was the night she first saw the photos. Adrian in Monaco, arm in arm with Serena Valle, smiling like a man who had nothing to hide and everything to gain. The gossip columns labeled Serena a promising art dealer, but the captions left little to the imagination. Adrian Kane debuts new companion in Monaco. Isabella's phone lit up with messages from friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances. Most were sympathetic, some were curious, a few were pitying. She responded to none of them. The days that followed were a blur of lawyers, signed papers, and public statements. Adrian's PR team spun the story as an amicable separation, but Isabella knew better. He had been building his new life long before ending the old one. When the divorce was finalized, she walked away with a settlement that could have bought her comfort for the rest of her days. But she also walked away with something more valuable: her silence. She refused interviews, declined TV appearances, ignored offers from publishers for a tell-all memoir. The public read her absence as weakness. But those who truly knew her, the few friends she still trusted, recognized it for what it was: strategy. Because while Adrian was busy parading Serena through every luxury hotspot in Europe, Isabella was quietly reshaping her life. She sold the penthouse, she closed her shared accounts, she traveled, not to be seen, but to learn. She studied Mediterranean architecture in Greece, sourced textiles from Morocco, and worked under a master carpenter in Tuscany. Her projects grew smaller in scale but deeper in meaning. A family-owned inn in Lisbon, a children's reading room in Marseille. Each one built her reputation not in society pages, but in circles that valued craft over spectacle. And then came the invitation. It arrived on heavy cream stationery, the kind that smelled faintly of cedar. At the top was a crest she recognized instantly: Victor Sterling's. They had met years earlier at a London charity auction, where she'd bid on a set of antique French armchairs he donated. He had admired her taste. She had admired his ability to disappear from a room full of cameras without anyone noticing. The note was brief. "I'm commissioning a redesign of the Sterling Foundation's flagship yacht. I'd like you to oversee it. Discretion required. Monaco Harbor, July." She almost said no. She wasn't ready to return to the place where her marriage had ended so publicly. But something in her, a quiet, simmering resolve, said yes. The months that followed were a blur of sketches, fabric swatches, and private consultations aboard the yet unnamed yacht. Victor proved to be an ideal client: decisive, respectful, and uninterested in wasting words. Slowly, a professional partnership turned into something else. Not romance exactly, but an unspoken alliance. He knew she was rebuilding. She knew he valued loyalty above all else. By the time July came, the yacht was ready, and so was she. Which was why, when Victor invited her to step aboard for its first official unveiling, she didn't hesitate. She knew Adrian would be there. She knew Serena would be on his arm. And she knew the crowd would remember every detail of how she looked, how she walked, how she smiled. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about reclaiming the space she'd been pushed out of, on her own terms. And as the night in Monaco unfolded, with camera flashes and whispered speculation following her every step, Isabella realized something she hadn't felt in a long time: control. But what she didn't know yet was that her return to Monaco would spark a chain of events that would cost Adrian far more than just his pride. The Monaco harbor glittered like a jewelry case spilled open under the summer night sky. Strings of golden bulbs draped from mast to mast, casting a warm glow over the polished teak decks. Champagne fountains sparkled beside marble ice sculptures, and trays of oysters floated through the crowd in the hands of silent, white-gloved servers. The Eternité wasn't just a yacht tonight. It was a stage. From where she stood, Isabella could see the way the light bounced off the water, turning the reflections into tiny shards of gold. She inhaled slowly, letting the air fill her lungs. She had rehearsed this in her mind, the moment she would step into a place that once belonged entirely to Adrian's world and claim it without hesitation. Victor Sterling's presence beside her was steady, almost invisible to those who didn't know him well. He was a man who could command a room with one glance, but tonight he let her take the lead. He leaned down, his voice low enough for only her to hear. You have their attention. Don't give it away. She smiled faintly. I don't intend to. Meanwhile, just 20 yards away on the upper deck of the Eternité, Adrian Kane was doing what he did best, pretending he wasn't rattled. He laughed too loudly at a joke from a shipping magnate, gestured too broadly while telling a story about his latest acquisition, and kept Serena's manicured hand looped tightly through his arm, as though it were a trophy he couldn't afford to drop. But his eyes kept drifting, toward the dock, toward the vision, in ivory silk who had just arrived. The moment Isabella and Victor stepped aboard, a ripple passed through the crowd. Conversations paused, heads tilted. Even the seasoned billionaires and aristocrats, people immune to most forms of surprise, were caught off guard. Isabella's gown was cut simply but perfectly, hugging her waist before spilling into a cascade of fabric that moved like a whisper. The diamonds at her ears caught the light only when she turned her head, never ostentatious, only precise. A few journalists, sensing a story, began snapping pictures. "Is that Isabella Kane?" one murmured to another, already raising her camera. "She goes by Moore again," came the reply. "And she's with Sterling. Can you imagine what Adrian's thinking right now?" What Adrian was thinking was not printable. The Eternité's captain, clearly briefed on the guest list, welcomed Victor warmly and extended the same courtesy to Isabella. If Adrian had any say, she wouldn't have been allowed within 50 feet of the yacht. But in Monaco's high society, the host's influence stopped where Victor Sterling's began. They moved through the crowd at a measured pace, Victor engaging in brief but significant exchanges with men in tailored tuxedos and women in couture gowns. Isabella played her part perfectly. Poised, gracious, attentive, offering nods and smiles but never lingering too long. Every interaction was a reminder that she wasn't here as someone's ex-wife. She was here as an equal. Up on the mezzanine deck, Serena was struggling to keep her composure. She recognized the way eyes followed Isabella, the way people leaned toward her, eager to be drawn into her orbit. It was the same attention Serena had enjoyed since arriving on Adrian's arm, and now it was slipping away, inch by inch. Adrian squeezed her hand. "Ignore her," he muttered. "I am," Serena replied, though her jaw tightened. But neither of them could truly ignore her. Isabella was too deliberate in her presence. She paused at the champagne bar, accepting a flute with a polite nod to the server. She stepped toward the edge of the deck, letting the harbor breeze lift a tendril of her hair. And each time she moved, it was as though the crowd's focus shifted with her. Victor excused himself to speak with a group of investors near the starboard rail, leaving Isabella momentarily alone. It was then that a familiar voice slid through the noise, smooth as glass. "Didn't expect to see you here." She turned. Adrian stood there, smile fixed, eyes sharp. Up close, the years between them were both nothing and everything. He looked exactly as she remembered, the same broad shoulders, the same careful grooming, but there was a tension in his face she had never seen before. "Why wouldn't you expect it?" she asked lightly. His gaze flicked over her dress, her jewelry, the calm in her eyes. "Because you always hated these parties." She let the corner of her mouth lift. "People change." He took a half step closer. "Is that what this is? Change? Or is it some kind of statement?" "Why would I need to make a statement?" she replied, tilting her head. "I'm just here as a guest." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "With Victor Sterling." "That seems obvious," she said. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of history pressing in from all sides. Around them, the party swelled back to life. The band struck up a soft jazz number, and glasses clinked as trays of truffled canapés circulated. But in that small pocket of space, it was just them, the ghost of what they'd been, and the unspoken question of what she was here to do. "Careful, Isabella," Adrian said finally, his voice low. "This world has sharp edges." She smiled fully this time. "So do I." Before he could respond, Victor returned, his expression unreadable. "Adrian," he said in a tone that was both greeting and dismissal, "I see you've met my designer." Adrian's brows lifted. "Designer?" "Yes," Victor said, his hand resting lightly on Isabella's back. "She's responsible for everything you see on the Vespera. We docked just across from you." There was a flicker in Adrian's eyes, recognition, then something darker. "The Vespera is yours?" he asked Isabella. She didn't answer. She simply let the silence sit, heavy and deliberate. Victor turned to her. "Shall we take a walk? There are a few people I'd like you to meet." She nodded, and together they moved back into the crowd, leaving Adrian standing alone, the music and laughter pressing in on him like a tide. Up on the mezzanine, Serena was watching. Her glass of champagne was untouched, the bubbles going flat. She didn't need to hear the words to know the balance in the room had shifted. People were no longer glancing at Adrian to see his new partner. They were glancing to see his reaction to the woman he had lost. And as the night deepened, whispers began to coil through the party like smoke. About the Vespera, about Victor's choice of company, about what Isabella's presence might mean for Adrian's next big deal. None of them knew yet that by the time the sun rose over Monaco, those whispers would have teeth. The eternité had settled into its rhythm. Glasses clinking, polite laughter rolling over the deck, the band's music weaving through the humid Monaco air. From a distance, it looked like any other night of power mingling among the elite. But those who were paying attention could feel it. The undercurrent, the shift, the sharp edge in the air that hadn't been there before Isabella arrived. Up on the aft deck, Adrian's grip on his champagne flute tightened with each passing minute. Victor Sterling's presence was bad enough. But seeing Isabella, radiant and composed, drifting easily between conversations with oil tycoons and European royals, was eating at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Serena, for her part, had tried to reclaim the spotlight. She'd laughed loudly at the right moments, leaned in toward important guests, even dropped a few names she barely knew. But it wasn't working. The glances she got were pitying now, not admiring. She was no longer the centerpiece of the night. She was a decorative detail. Adrian finally decided he'd had enough. He wasn't going to let Isabella stroll in and turn his yacht's debut into her stage. He spotted her near the starboard rail, speaking with a pair of investors from Dubai, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood, her smile effortless. He strode over, the smile on his face tight but present. "Mind if I borrow her for a moment, gentlemen?" The investors glanced between the two of them, sensing something unspoken, but stepped aside politely. Isabella didn't move from her spot. "What can I do for you, Adrian?" "I think you've made your entrance," he said, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Now it's time to go." She arched a brow. "Go? I'm a guest. Victor invited me." His jaw flexed. "You've made your point." She met his eyes, calm and steady. "What point do you think I'm making? That you can show up here with Sterling and, what? Make me look small?" His voice was edged now, though still too quiet to draw attention. "Adrian," she said softly, "I don't need to make you look small. You're doing that just fine on your own." For a split second, the mask cracked. He leaned in, his tone dropping into a dangerous whisper. "Careful, Isabella. This isn't your world anymore." She let a slow smile spread across her lips. "You keep saying that, as if repeating it will make it true." Before he could reply, Victor appeared at her side as if summoned by instinct. "Adrian," he said evenly, "I was just telling the Minister of Commerce how brilliant Isabella's redesign of the Vespera turned out. Have you had a tour yet?" Adrian's eyes narrowed. "I've been busy hosting." Victor's gaze was steady, unreadable. "Then you've missed something remarkable." Several nearby guests had caught fragments of the exchange, and like sharks sensing blood, they began to circle. Not physically, but with their eyes, their ears, their quiet curiosity. The energy shifted again, the conversation's center of gravity tilting toward the three of them. Serena, seeing the cluster forming, moved closer. She slipped her arm through Adrian's, smiling at Isabella with the kind of sweetness that had venom just beneath it. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said. "I've heard so much." Isabella's gaze flicked to her, then back to Adrian. "I'm sure you have." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of something unspoken. A few people nearby stifled smiles, others looked away, pretending not to notice. Serena, unwilling to let the moment go, pressed on. "Adrian tells me you've been keeping busy. Must be nice to have so much free time." "Free time?" Isabella tilted her head. "Designing a yacht for Victor Sterling isn't exactly leisure." The mention of Victor's name again, and the implication of professional partnership, sent another ripple through the listeners. Adrian could feel the ground shifting beneath him, his control of the night slipping further with every word. He tightened his grip on Serena's arm. "Enjoy the party." he said to Isabella, his tone final. But Isabella didn't respond to him. Instead, she turned to Victor, her voice light but carrying just enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Shall we head back to the Vespera? There are a few details I'd like your opinion on before the press tour tomorrow." Victor smiled. "Of course." And with that, they moved away, leaving Adrian and Serena standing in the middle of the deck, surrounded by people who were suddenly very interested in their champagne glasses. It should have ended there. A subtle but unmistakable victory for Isabella. But fate, or perhaps karma, wasn't finished. Half an hour later, as the band played a lilting bossa nova tune, one of Adrian's key investors approached Victor. "Sterling," the man greeted warmly. "I didn't know you were in Monaco for the launch. Are you considering a stake?" Victor's answer was casual, almost bored. "No, I'm here for Isabella. She's presenting her latest work tomorrow. I'm making introductions." The investor's brows rose. "Presenting? To whom? To anyone interested in luxury that doesn't need to shout to be heard?" Victor replied, his eyes briefly meeting Adrian's across the deck. It was a perfectly polite answer, and yet, in this world, it was a blade slid between ribs. Adrian knew exactly what it meant. Clients, contracts, and the kind of social capital that could shift loyalties overnight. Serena leaned in. "He's trying to provoke you," she whispered. But Adrian didn't answer. His gaze was locked on Isabella, who was now laughing softly with the Minister of Commerce, her hand brushing Victor's sleeve in an easy, familiar gesture. She looked untouchable. And worse, she looked free. The music swelled, the crowd moved, and the night carried on as though nothing had happened. But Adrian could feel it, the walls of his carefully built image tightening around him. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, an unexpected announcement cut through the party, and every head turned toward the source. The chime of a silver bell rang out across the eternité, crisp and clear over the music. It wasn't the kind of sound people ignored. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the band slowed to a halt, their instruments trailing off as heads turned toward the main deck. A man in a tailored navy suit, the event coordinator, stepped into the center, a small microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the soft lapping of water against the hull. "If I may have your attention for a very special announcement." Adrian straightened, forcing a smile. This was the moment he'd planned. The one where he would reveal the Eternité's new partnership with a major luxury travel conglomerate. It was supposed to be his headline, his night. But then the coordinator glanced toward the dock. "We are honored to share that tomorrow morning, right here in Monaco Harbor, an exclusive press event will take place aboard the Vespera, the newly redesigned flagship of the Sterling Foundation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Adrian's smile faltered. The coordinator continued, oblivious to the undercurrent. "The Vespera will be unveiled to select media and high-profile guests, showcasing the work of renowned designer, Miss Isabella Moore." The name landed like a stone in still water, sending shockwaves through every corner of the deck. People turned instinctively toward her. Isabella, standing near the champagne bar, did not flinch. She simply inclined her head in acknowledgement, her expression serene. Adrian's chest tightened. This was supposed to be his evening, his yacht, his crowd. And now, half the room was buzzing about hers. The coordinator smiled. "We invite you to visit the Vespera tomorrow. For tonight, please enjoy the rest of the celebration." The moment he stepped away, the murmurs turned into a low hum. Investors, editors, and socialites began whispering in corners, already recalculating their schedules for the next morning. The center of gravity had shifted, and it wasn't on the Eternité. Serena's grip on Adrian's arm tightened. "Did you know about this?" she hissed. "No," he said flatly, his eyes locked on Isabella. She was now surrounded by a small cluster of guests. The very ones Adrian had planned to impress tonight. The Minister of Commerce, a shipping heir from Hong Kong, a tech magnate from Berlin. They leaned toward her as she spoke, listening intently, laughing at some quiet remark. Victor Sterling stood just behind her, not dominating the conversation, but anchoring it, his presence alone a silent endorsement. Adrian moved toward them, the crowd parting just enough to let him through. "Quite the announcement," he said, his tone light but with an edge only Isabella would hear. She met his gaze evenly. "It wasn't planned for tonight. Convenient timing, though," he said. She smiled faintly. Some things don't need planning. They just happen. Victor's voice entered the space between them. Adrian, you should come by tomorrow. You might pick up a few ideas. A couple of nearby guests chuckled quietly. Adrian's jaw tightened. I think I'm doing just fine. Victor's expression didn't change. If you say so. The conversation might have ended there, but fate, or perhaps the collective instinct of a room smelling blood, had other plans. An investor from Dubai, clearly enjoying the tension, spoke up. Adrian, will the Eternité be open for press tours as well? Or is tonight the only showing? Before Adrian could answer, another voice chimed in. A woman from the Monaco Times. Yes, will there be access tomorrow? It would be interesting to compare the two vessels side by side. The words hit harder than they should have. Compare. As if his yacht and Victor's could even be measured in the same breath. Adrian forced a laugh. The Eternité speaks for itself, no need for comparisons. But the investors weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Isabella, their eyes alight with curiosity. She didn't gloat, she didn't have to. The room was doing it for her. Across the deck, the band struck up another song, trying to pull the evening back into its original rhythm. But the shift had happened. The night belonged to Isabella now. Serena, sensing the danger, pulled Adrian aside. You have to get control of this, right now. He nodded, though his thoughts were already racing. Damage control. Spin. He could still salvage this. But then Victor raised his glass in a quiet toast to the group around him. To new beginnings, he said. His eyes met Isabella's, and she smiled. The simple gesture was like a spark to dry tinder. The small circle of guests echoed the toast, their glasses catching the light. A photographer, quick on the uptake, captured the moment. Isabella and Victor, framed by crystal and gold, the caption practically writing itself. Adrian turned away, the muscles in his neck tight. This wasn't just about a yacht anymore. It was about power, perception, and the sudden, chilling realization that he was no longer in control of either. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. He spoke to guests, he smiled for photos, but his mind was already on tomorrow. He couldn't let the Vespera outshine him. Not here. Not in Monaco. As the party wound down, he watched Isabella step gracefully down the gangway toward the dock. Victor was beside her, one hand resting lightly at her back. Cameras flashed as they boarded the Vespera, its dark hull gleaming under the lights. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something he hadn't felt since before he built his empire. The ground shifting beneath him. And the moment he learned what Isabella planned to reveal at tomorrow's event, he realized the night's humiliation was only the beginning. The Eternité's lights still shimmered against the dark water when Adrian returned to his penthouse in the early hours of the morning. Monaco's harbor was quiet now, but the echo of murmured conversations from the night before seemed to follow him inside like ghosts. He tossed his jacket onto a chair and went straight to the bar, pouring a glass of scotch without bothering for ice. Serena trailed in behind him, kicking off her stilettos with a frustrated sigh. You let her own the night, she said, her voice sharp in the silence. Adrian downed half the drink before answering. I didn't let her do anything. She blindsided me. She humiliated you, Serena pressed. Right there in front of everyone, and Victor Sterling of all people? He doesn't even like these events. He came just for her. Adrian set the glass down hard enough to make the amber liquid ripple. I know exactly why he came. The question is, what does she think she's doing? Serena crossed her arms. You know what she's doing. She's making you look weak. The truth stung because it was so close to the bone. Adrian had built his image carefully over the years. The self-made billionaire, the visionary, the man who never looked back. But Isabella's reappearance, with Victor at her side, had cracked that image in a single night. He paced to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glimmering water where the Vespera was docked. Even now, under the dim dock lights, it looked sleek, untouchable. Tomorrow, that yacht would be filled with press and power brokers. The same people he needed for his next expansion deal. If Isabella managed to charm them, she could easily redirect attention, funding, and influence away from him. He turned back to Serena. Get me the guest list for her event tomorrow. I want to know exactly who she's invited. And then? Serena asked. Then, Adrian said slowly, we make sure they remember the Eternité, not her. Across the harbor, in the quiet interior of the Vespera, Isabella was in no rush to sleep. The yacht's design was her proudest work yet. Every surface, every detail carried her touch. The hand-woven Moroccan rugs in the lounges, the Italian marble counters in the open-air bar, the custom brass fixtures shaped by an artisan she'd found in Lisbon. But it wasn't just beautiful, it was purposeful. This unveiling wasn't about showing off, it was about proving a point. That elegance didn't need spectacle, that true luxury was in the details you didn't have to announce. In the main salon, Victor poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to her. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. She took the glass. "I wasn't sure how I'd feel seeing him again." "And now?" she thought for a moment. "Now, I think I understand him better than I ever did before. Everything he does is about control. The moment he loses it, he starts to unravel." Victor's lips curved faintly. "Then tomorrow should be interesting." They sat together in the soft hum of the yacht's systems, the Mediterranean night pressing gently against the windows. Isabella knew tomorrow would be a test, not just for Adrian, but for herself. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to stand in the space he once told her she didn't belong, and to own it entirely. Before heading to bed, she walked through the Vespera one last time. The deck gleamed under the soft lighting, the glass railings crystal clear, the floral arrangements fresh and understated. Everything was ready. Adrian didn't sleep. He spent the night at his desk, flipping through contacts, sending messages, calling in favors. By dawn, he had arranged for an impromptu brunch aboard the Eternité to coincide with the Vespera's unveiling. He told himself it was strategic. If he could keep enough important people on his yacht, Isabella's event would be a mere footnote. But underneath the calculated moves was something far less controlled, the gnawing dread that she had already won. By 9 a.m., the Monaco harbor was alive again. Photographers clustered along the docks, their lenses sweeping from one yacht to the other. Luxury cars lined up at the private entrance, their passengers stepping out in tailored suits and couture dresses. On the Vespera, Isabella greeted guests as they arrived. Her smile warm but measured. She didn't rush. She let each introduction breathe, making people feel seen in a way that was rare in this world of constant self-promotion. On the Eternité, Adrian worked the crowd with Serena at his side, offering champagne and carefully rehearsed charm. He could see the flow of people, some choosing his deck first, others making straight for Isabella's. The split attention gnawed at him. From across the water, Isabella caught his eye once. She didn't hold the gaze long, just enough to acknowledge that she saw him and that she wasn't concerned. Victor joined her on the upper deck, where a small group of journalists was setting up. "They're already whispering," he said quietly. "About what?" "That you're launching a design firm for luxury vessels." Isabella smiled faintly. "Let them whisper." She wasn't ready to make that announcement yet. But when she did, she wanted Adrian to hear it with everyone else. As the morning sun turned the water to gold, guests began touring the Vespera, touching the smooth finishes, admiring the subtle engineering. More than one remarked on how calm and welcoming the space felt compared to the flash of the Eternité. Every compliment was another thread pulled from Adrian's control. By midday, the harbor was humming with comparison. Journalists moved back and forth between the 2 yachts, taking notes, snapping photos. Investors whispered about partnerships. Even a few of Adrian's allies slipped away to see what all the talk was about. Adrian felt it, the narrative sliding from his grasp. Serena noticed too, her smile growing thinner by the hour. "What if we—" she began, but Adrian cut her off. "Not here," he said sharply. He was already thinking ahead. If Isabella wanted a public game, he would give her one. And he had just the move in mind. Because before the day was over, he planned to turn her moment into a scandal she couldn't control. By early afternoon, the Monaco harbor had become a battlefield, not in the traditional sense, but in the silent, high-stakes war of reputation. The Vespera was holding its own press tour, drawing in journalists, investors, and influencers with the quiet confidence of a masterpiece. The Eternité sparkled nearby, but its shine was dulled by the murmurs about Isabella's work. Adrian stood on his upper deck, arms crossed, watching the steady stream of guests boarding the Vespera. Every person who crossed that gangway felt like a blow to his pride. The air was warm, heavy with salt and perfume, but he felt cold inside. The kind of cold that comes when you know you're losing ground. Serena approached with a forced smile. "I talked to a few of the reporters," she said. "They're curious about the Eternité. I told them we'd be making an important announcement later today." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "What announcement?" She hesitated. "We could leak something. Maybe a partnership, or a new investment deal. Something that makes headlines." He considered it, but then another idea came. Sharper, riskier. "No, I have something better in mind." 2 hours later, a man in a gray suit and sunglasses appeared at the edge of the Vespera's dock. He carried a slim leather briefcase and a press badge clipped to his jacket. No one noticed as he blended in with the small crowd of media waiting for the second wave of tours. From the Eternité, Adrian watched him. This was one of his problem solvers. Discreet, efficient, and expensive. The plan was simple. Slip an anonymous packet into the hands of a journalist aboard the Vespera. Inside would be documents. Some true, some fabricated, suggesting Isabella's design firm had been secretly funded by an overseas investor with a questionable reputation. In this world, even a hint of impropriety could stain a reputation overnight. If the story broke, her perfect debut would be overshadowed by scandal. On the Vespera, Isabella was guiding a group of guests through the main salon when Victor's head of security, a tall man named Harris, approached quietly. "Miss Moore," he said in a low voice, "we've spotted someone loitering near the press group. Doesn't match the official list." Isabella's eyes flicked toward the dock. "Press badge? Yes, but it's not one of ours." Victor joined them, his expression tightening as Harris explained. "Escort him off the dock," Victor ordered, quietly, "and find out who sent him." Harris nodded and slipped away, his movements smooth, barely drawing attention. Isabella continued her tour, her voice steady, but inside, her instincts were humming. She knew Adrian wouldn't sit by and watch her succeed. She just didn't know how far he'd go. Back on the Eternité, Adrian sipped his drink, scanning the Vespera through dark sunglasses. When the man in the gray suit disappeared from view, he assumed the drop had been made. Serena stood beside him. "You think it'll work?" "It doesn't have to be true," Adrian said. "It just has to be believable." But minutes later, he noticed something strange. The man hadn't returned. In fact, there was no sign of him at all. On the Vespera, Harris reappeared, leaning down to speak quietly to Victor. "We've got him in a secure room on the lower deck. He's carrying a packet with financial documents and a note addressed to a journalist from the Riviera Daily. We're having it photographed now." Victor's mouth curved slightly. "And? The documents are fakes. Whoever sent him wanted to smear Miss Moore." Victor's gaze shifted to Isabella, who was speaking to a pair of yacht engineers near the helm. "Let's not ruin her day," he said. "For now, keep it contained." But Isabella noticed their exchange. When the guests moved on, she joined Victor, her voice low. "That was him, wasn't it, Adrian?" Victor didn't confirm, but the flicker in his eyes was answer enough. She exhaled slowly. "Then I want the packet." An hour later, she had it in her hands. The contents were exactly what she expected. A web of numbers and shell companies, meant to suggest she was nothing more than a figurehead for someone else's money. She sat in the private lounge, turning the pages one by one. The brazenness almost made her laugh. Victor watched her. "You could go public with this. Expose him." "Not yet," she said. "If I move too soon, it looks like a personal grudge, but if I wait—" Her smile was quiet, dangerous. "It'll look like truth coming to light." On the Eternité, Adrian was beginning to sense that something had gone wrong. The man in the gray suit hadn't reported back, and none of the journalists looked rattled. In fact, a few were smiling as they left the Vespera, exchanging cards with Isabella's team. By late afternoon, the chatter on the docks was leaning heavily in Isabella's favor. Words like innovative, timeless, and visionary floated in the air. Guests from the Eternité began drifting over to see what the fuss was about. Serena's patience snapped. "She's winning. You know that, right?" Adrian didn't answer. His phone buzzed. An encrypted message from his fixer. Packet intercepted. Couldn't deliver. He felt his stomach drop. That evening, as the last tours wrapped up, Isabella stood on the upper deck of the Vespera, watching the sunset bleed into the Mediterranean. The light caught her face, soft and warm. Below, photographers were still taking shots, their lenses catching Victor at her side. She knew Adrian was watching from across the harbor. She could feel it, the same way she used to feel his eyes on her in crowded rooms years ago. But this time there was no warmth in it, only the sharp edge of a man realizing his power wasn't absolute. Victor handed her a glass of champagne. "Tomorrow," he said, "we decide how to use what we found today." She touched her glass to his. "Tomorrow." And far across the water, Adrian was already planning something even more reckless, a move that could destroy them both if it failed. By the time the harbor lights shimmered against the darkening water, Adrian was done playing defense. The failed smear attempt had rattled him, but it hadn't killed his will to fight. In fact, it made something dangerous spark to life inside him, the same ruthless streak that had built his empire from nothing. Serena, however, wasn't convinced. She watched him stalk across the Eternité's deck, phone in hand, jaw tight. "Adrian," she said cautiously, "maybe you should leave it alone. The more you push, the more it looks like you're obsessed." He stopped and looked at her, his voice low and clipped. "This isn't about obsession. This is about control. She thinks she can humiliate me in front of my peers. I'm going to make sure she regrets it." Serena frowned. "What exactly are you planning?" "You'll see," he said, already dialing a number. An hour later, a small motor launch glided across the dark water toward the Vespera. From a distance, it looked like another VIP transfer. But inside, two men dressed in black carried a locked metal case. Adrian had called in an old debt, a favor from a man who owed him more than money. Inside that case was a rare, antique maritime artifact, a gold-plated compass supposedly belonging to a 19th century shipping tycoon. The piece was worth millions and carried a shadowy provenance. Its ownership had been contested in European courts for decades. The plan was simple: plant the compass somewhere aboard the Vespera, then discover it during a casual tour the next day. The resulting headlines, "Billionaire's yacht found to hold stolen artifact," would drown out any praise for Isabella's work. It was reckless, illegal, and if traced back to him, ruinous. But Adrian had calculated that if the artifact was found in Victor's possession, it would be the sterling name that took the fall, and Isabella's reputation with it. On the Vespera, Isabella and Victor were hosting a small evening reception for their closest allies. The atmosphere was relaxed, low music, candlelight flickering against polished surfaces, the Mediterranean breeze weaving in from the open deck. Victor was mid-conversation with a Swiss banker when Harris, his head of security, appeared again. His voice was low but urgent. "We've got unusual activity on the water. A small craft approaching from the south, no formal docking request." Victor's expression didn't change. "Where will they reach us?" "Port side, near the aft service entrance." Isabella's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Victor glanced at her. "Probably nothing, but I don't like uninvited guests." Harris and two crew members moved quickly, intercepting the motor launch before it could reach the boarding platform. The men inside claimed they were delivering a private gift for the unveiling, but their credentials didn't match the name they gave. One of the crewmen spotted the locked metal case. When Harris insisted it be opened for inspection, the men refused. That was all he needed. Within minutes, the launch was escorted away under the watchful eye of harbor security, the case now in Harris's possession. Up on the deck, Victor took the news in stride. "You'll want to see this," he told Isabella as they followed Harris to a secure room. When the case was opened and the compass revealed, Isabella's breath caught, not because she recognized it, but because she understood exactly what was happening. "This isn't random," she said quietly. "This was meant to be found here, to make it look like we're hiding something." Victor studied her face. "And you think Adrian sent it?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." Victor poured himself a drink, his movements deliberate. "We could hand it over to the authorities tonight, make a statement before it goes public." But Isabella shook her head slowly. "No, that's what he wants. For us to scramble, to look defensive. If we play this right, we can turn it back on him." Victor raised a brow. "You have something in mind?" She nodded. "Tomorrow morning, during the press conference, we'll make an announcement, but it won't be what he expects." Back on the Eternité, Adrian was waiting for the message confirming the drop. When his phone finally buzzed, it wasn't from his men. It was from a contact inside the harbor's private security network. The text was short. "Package intercepted. Sterling security has it. Adrian felt his stomach knot. If Victor had the compass, then they might already suspect him. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to think. Maybe they'd keep it quiet. Maybe they wouldn't risk the scandal either. But a darker thought crept in. What if they decided to use it against him? Serena noticed his change in expression. What happened? Nothing, he lied. Everything's fine. But she knew better. That night, Isabella sat alone in her private quarters aboard the Vespera, looking out at the harbor lights. She thought about the years she'd spent being blindsided by Adrian's games, reacting instead of acting. That ended now. She opened her laptop and began drafting her speech for the morning. It wasn't just about the yacht anymore. It was about drawing a line, not in anger, but in absolute clarity, between who she had been and who she was now. Victor knocked lightly on the door. "You're sure about this?" "Yes," she said, closing the laptop. "If he wants to play dirty, then I'll show him what happens when you underestimate someone who's been quiet for too long." By midnight, Monaco was settling into its restless hush. The harbor gleamed, the yacht swayed gently, and two people lay awake on opposite sides of the water, one plotting his next move, the other preparing to end the game entirely. Neither of them knew that tomorrow's announcement would not only expose the truth, but drag an unexpected third player into the spotlight, someone whose loyalty could change everything. The morning sun spilled gold over the Monaco harbor, casting long, shimmering paths across the water. The Vespera was a picture of poise, flags fluttering in the breeze, polished decks gleaming under the soft light. Crew members moved with quiet precision, setting up for the day's most anticipated event. On the dock, photographers jostled for position. Journalists checked their equipment, flipping through their notes, their chatter low but charged. There was a hum in the air, not just about the unveiling of a luxury yacht, but about the woman at the center of it all. Isabella stepped onto the upper deck just as the first flashes went off. She was dressed in a tailored white suit that seemed to hold the sunlight. Her hair swept back, every line of her posture calm and deliberate. Victor followed a step behind, his presence steady but unobtrusive, the kind of quiet power that made people straighten their backs without realizing it. Across the harbor on the Eternité, Adrian watched through a pair of binoculars. Even from this distance, he could feel the gravity of the moment. The way people leaned toward her, the way cameras seemed to follow her every move. Serena, sipping coffee beside him, said, "If you're going to make a move, it has to be now." He didn't answer. He was still debating whether to call a certain journalist and tip them off about the compass. But something in him hesitated, the gnawing suspicion that Isabella might already be expecting it. Back on the Vespera, the press conference began with the usual pleasantries. An introduction from a Monaco tourism official, a few words from Victor about the Sterling Foundation's commitment to craftsmanship. Then it was Isabella's turn. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice clear and warm. "When I began designing the Vespera, my goal was simple: to create a space where luxury didn't have to shout, where every detail was an invitation to breathe." The crowd listened intently, many nodding as she spoke about sustainability, artisanal work, and the balance between beauty and function. But then she paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to draw every ear closer. "However," she continued, "last night something unexpected happened." A ripple moved through the crowd. Cameras clicked faster. A small craft approached the Vespera without authorization. On board were two men carrying a locked metal case. Our security team intercepted them before they could board, and inside we found this. At her signal, Harris stepped forward, carrying the gold-plated compass in a clear protective case. The sunlight flashed against it, and a low murmur swept the dock. "This artifact," Isabella said, "is a piece of maritime history. It is also the subject of an ongoing legal dispute regarding rightful ownership." Whispers turned into hushed conversations. The journalists knew the name of this artifact. It had been in the headlines before. "I want to make something very clear," Isabella continued, her gaze steady. "This compass did not come from the Vespera. It was placed here deliberately, by someone hoping to create the illusion of wrongdoing." The crowd leaned forward as she let the words hang in the air. "I will not speculate publicly on who might do such a thing," she said. "But I will say this. When you try to tarnish someone's work, all you truly reveal is your fear of it. A few cameras swung toward the Eternité moored across the harbor. Adrian, watching from his deck, felt the air leave his lungs. Victor stepped to the microphone next, his tone calm but cutting. The Sterling Foundation will be working with the appropriate authorities to ensure the artifact is returned to its rightful home. We will also be increasing security for all future events. In the meantime, our focus remains on celebrating the Vespera and the extraordinary vision of Miss Moore. The applause was immediate and sustained. Guests began whispering, not about the alleged scandal, but about Isabella's composure. In the front row, a journalist from the Riviera Daily raised her hand. "Miss Moore, will this incident affect your plans moving forward?" Isabella smiled. "Not at all. In fact, today I am pleased to announce something I've kept quiet until now. The launch of Moore Maritime Design, an independent firm dedicated to bespoke luxury vessels. The Vespera is our first project. It will not be the last." The announcement landed like a wave hitting shore, sudden, forceful, impossible to ignore. Photographers surged forward, questions overlapping. Investors exchanged glances, already calculating opportunities. Across the harbor, Adrian slammed the binoculars down onto the table. "She set me up," he muttered. Serena's brows drew together. "What do you mean?" "She wanted me to try something. She knew I couldn't resist, and now she's turned it into free publicity." Serena hesitated. "So, what do we do now?" Adrian stared at the Vespera, at the way the crowd seemed to cling to Isabella's every word. For the first time, he had no immediate answer. On the dock, the press conference ended with a tour. Guests stepped aboard the Vespera, their voices full of admiration, their attention wholly on Isabella. She moved through the crowd like a conductor through an orchestra, each gesture purposeful, each smile genuine. Victor leaned in at one point and murmured, "You realize you just made it impossible for him to touch you without making himself look worse." "That was the point," she said softly. By late afternoon, the harbor buzzed with one story. Not the compass, not the sabotage, but Isabella's new company and the Vespera's groundbreaking design. Adrian knew the battle for the day was lost, but in the quiet of his mind, a darker thought took shape. This wasn't over. If he couldn't win in the public eye, he would find another way. And that's when a figure from Isabella's past, long thought gone, stepped onto the dock and walked straight toward the Vespera. The figure on the dock drew curious glances as he moved with calm purpose toward the Vespera. He was tall, dressed in a crisp navy suit, his silver hair catching the sunlight. Isabella's breath caught the moment she recognized him. "Michael?" she said under her breath. Victor looked at her. "You know him?" She nodded slowly. "My former mentor, the man who taught me design before I ever met Adrian. I haven't seen him in 10 years. Michael climbed aboard the Vespera with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. When he saw Isabella, his face broke into a warm smile. "You've outdone yourself," he said, his voice rich with pride. They embraced briefly, but Isabella felt tension beneath his calm exterior. She pulled back. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about the compass," he said. "And I heard who sent it. I thought you might need some help, closing a chapter." Across the harbor, Adrian noticed the new arrival. Even at a distance, recognition flared. Michael was not just a mentor to Isabella, but also an old business rival who had once exposed Adrian's early financial misdeeds. If Michael was here, it meant trouble. Adrian decided he wouldn't wait for trouble to come to him. He boarded his tender and ordered it toward the Vespera. Serena trailed behind reluctantly, muttering, "You're walking into her territory." "I don't care," he said. "If they want to talk, we'll talk." By the time Adrian stepped onto the Vespera's deck, the afternoon light had softened into gold. Guests were still mingling, but the atmosphere shifted noticeably as eyes turned toward the unexpected confrontation. Isabella stood near the rail with Victor and Michael, her expression calm but alert. Adrian walked up, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the show you've put on, Isabella." She didn't move. "It's not a show, Adrian. It's work. Something you wouldn't recognize if it wasn't wrapped in your name." A murmur passed through the small crowd that had started to gather. Adrian's gaze shifted to Michael. "And you? Couldn't resist coming back for the spotlight?" Michael's smile didn't waver. "I didn't come for the spotlight. I came because I don't like watching cowards take cheap shots from across the harbor." Victor stepped forward slightly, his presence a quiet wall between Adrian and Isabella. If you're here to make accusations, I suggest you choose your words carefully. Adrian's jaw tightened. Careful? She's the one parading herself as some self-made visionary when everyone knows. Michael cut him off. Everyone knows she built this. Every inch, every detail. The only thing people remember about you, Adrian, is how quickly you discard the people who help you climb. The words landed hard, rippling through the crowd. Adrian opened his mouth to retort, but Isabella's voice sliced clean through the tension. You taught me something important, Adrian, she said. That surviving isn't enough. If you want to live, you have to stop letting people write your story for you. From the corner, a journalist raised her phone, recording. Adrian noticed, his temper spiking. You think this is over? He hissed. It is for me, Isabella replied, because I'm done letting you stand in my way. Michael reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim folder. These are the receipts, he said loudly enough for several onlookers to hear. The proof that Adrian Kane funded last night's little delivery. Harbor Security has their copies, and so does the press. The shift was instant. Whispers spread like wildfire. A few guests stepped back from Adrian, as if afraid his downfall might be contagious. Serena, sensing the walls closing in, grabbed his arm. We need to go. Now. But Adrian stood frozen, staring at Isabella as if he could will her back into the shadow she'd once occupied. She didn't flinch. Victor broke the silence. I think you've overstayed your welcome. Adrian finally turned, his voice low but shaking. This isn't the end. Isabella's reply was quiet but carried all the way across the deck. It is for you. He left without another word, Serena trailing behind, the sound of camera shutters chasing them down the gangway. When the last of the uninvited tension left the yacht, Isabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Michael rested a hand on her shoulder. You handled that with more grace than I ever could have. It wasn't about grace, she said. It was about making sure he could never touch me again. Victor raised his glass. To new beginnings. They clinked glasses, the sunset painting the water in streaks of fire and rose. The crowd around them felt lighter now, laughter returning, the conversation flowing again. Later, when the last guests had gone and the harbor was quiet, Isabella stood alone at the rail. She thought about the years she'd lost, the nights she'd questioned her worth. The way she'd let someone else's power define her. No more. Victor joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. You know, the way you handled today. It's going to be talked about for a long time. She smiled faintly. Good. Maybe it'll remind someone else that walking away from the wrong person isn't the end of their story. It's the start. Michael stepped out onto the deck, the night air ruffling his hair. And remember, he said, power isn't in how loud you can shout. It's in how well you can stand when someone tries to knock you over. Isabella looked out at the calm, moonlit water. For the first time in years, she felt truly steady. Somewhere across the harbor, Adrian sat alone on his empty deck, realizing too late that the woman he'd underestimated had just rewritten the ending. And this time, she'd made sure it was hers. So the story has ended. My wonderful friends, are you still here with me until now? If you are, then maybe something in Isabella's journey has quietly touched your heart. You see, life isn't about never falling. It's about standing up with dignity when someone tries to push you down. As the old saying goes, a scar is not proof of your weakness, but proof you survived. If this story made you feel even a spark of courage, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep walking this road together. And tell me in the comments, what's the moment in your life where you chose to stand back up?